The photograph that would unravel everything came into existence at 40:47 on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in June, long before Aara understood what she had captured or why it unsettled her in ways she couldn't yet name. In those first hours back in Burwood, Georgia, she moved through her surroundings like someone displaced from her own life, unsure of where she fit, unsure of what she wanted, and increasingly aware of the strange constriction in her chest that tightened each time she turned into the driveway of her childhood home. The painted shutters, the careful wreath on the door, and her mother's familiar silhouette waiting behind the screen, always positioned as though expecting delivery, felt less like comfort and more like a script she had already outgrown. That summer had not yet revealed its truths to her. At that precise moment, all she knew was the weight of her camera in her hands, an old Nikon FM2, solid and unyielding, like something that held meaning beyond its surface. She lifted it almost automatically, framing a party she had no desire to attend, in a garden that no longer felt like hers, surrounded by people who recognized a version of her that no longer existed. Their familiarity pressed against her like an outdated photograph, accurate once, but no longer true. And then there was the woman. She stood just slightly removed from the rest, near a row of immaculate gardenias, holding a glass of white wine she hadn't touched, as though even participation required too much effort. There was something in her stillness, something in the quiet precision of her posture, that mirrored Aara's own internal dissonance. It was the look of someone inhabiting a life constructed by someone else, performing it convincingly enough to pass, yet never fully belonging inside it. Aara didn't hesitate. Film never allowed hesitation. The shutter moved because instinct demanded it, not because thought approved. Every frame carried weight, cost consequence. There was no excess, no careless repetition, only the singular decision made in the fragile space between breaths. Something about the woman compelled that decision. The angle of her chin, the distance in her eyes, not coldness, not indifference, but a quiet, self-contained exile triggered something immediate and unspoken. Before intention could intervene, the image was taken. The woman turned, not dramatically, not with any trace of performance, but with the subtle, precise shift of something attuned to being observed. Her gaze found the lens with unsettling accuracy. Dark eyes, steady and grounded, held the color of Georgia soil after rain, rich, quiet, and impossible to ignore. For 3 seconds the world narrowed. Everything else dissolved, the party, the expectations, the glass sweating in Aara's hand. The reason she had returned at all, identity itself, slipped out of focus. There was no past, no context, no explanation, only the undeniable awareness of being seen, fully and without distortion, by someone who seemed equally unprepared for the encounter. Then it ended. The woman looked away, finally lifting her glass as though resuming a role she had briefly forgotten to play. And the moment sealed itself shut, sinking beneath the surface like a stone disappearing into water. Aara lowered the camera, her grip no longer entirely steady. The gathering itself had been her mother's creation, as most things were. Patricia Vasquez had a particular talent for transforming private milestones into public spectacles, for turning moments that belonged to one person into events that belonged to everyone. Aara's recent graduation from the Savannah College of Art and Design, 4 years of discipline, of learning to shape light and shadow into meaning, had been deeply personal, a quiet triumph that had, for the first time, made her feel coherent, as though her life aligned with itself. But coherence had not followed her home. She had returned to Burwood out of necessity, not desire, carrying uncertainty in place of plans, and her mother had responded the only way she knew how, by organizing, inviting, assembling. What was meant to be small had quietly expanded, as it always did, until it filled the Sterling garden with familiar faces and inherited expectations. The garden itself was immaculate to the point of discomfort. Every bloom controlled, every pathway exact, every surface polished into submission. It was beauty without wildness, order without breath. A place that had never been allowed to become anything unexpected. Aara moved through it the only way she knew how, behind the camera. It gave her purpose, distance, and permission to observe without participating. She drifted between conversations, catching fragments of performance, laughter that lingered too long, smiles calibrated for approval, gestures shaped by habit rather than feeling. Most of it passed through her viewfinder without being captured. Not everything deserved to exist permanently. She had brought only one roll of film. 36 exposures. Each one mattered. Burwood offered endless images, but very few felt honest. Maya found her eventually, as she always did, appearing with the kind of ease that suggested she belonged anywhere without effort. There was something unchanged about her, an openness, a warmth that had never learned to disguise itself. Where others performed connection, Maya simply embodied it. Her presence softened something in Aara almost immediately, easing the tightness that had settled in her chest since returning. Familiarity, in this case, did not feel like confinement. It felt like relief. Their conversation moved lightly at first, slipping into old rhythms, humor layered over observation, both of them aware of the quiet absurdity of the event unfolding around them. But beneath it lingered something more fragile, time lost, distance felt, and the unspoken awareness that returning did not mean resuming. When Maya asked how she truly was, the answer resisted simplicity. It carried contradictions, achievement without direction, possibility without clarity, the strange dislocation of having built a self elsewhere only to return to a place that no longer recognized it. So Aara offered the closest version of truth she could manage without unraveling it entirely. She was figuring things out. It was incomplete, but it was real enough. Maya accepted it without pressing, understanding that some truths required time to surface on their own. And in that quiet acceptance, Aara felt both seen and protected, something rare enough to matter. Around them, the garden continued its performance, unchanged, controlled, and certain of itself. But something had already shifted, quietly and irrevocably, beginning with a single photograph taken at 4047. A moment that refused to stay contained within its frame. "Savannah is too close," Maya said softly, the words carrying a quiet insistence rather than argument. "You'd still come back all the time? I need you here fully." Her fingers brushed Aara's arm in a brief, grounding touch before her attention drifted across the garden. Then, almost as an afterthought but not really, she nodded toward the far edge. Her mother had been asking about Aara since the moment she heard she was back. Aara followed the direction of her gaze and found her again. Saraphina Sterling stood near the back wall of the garden, almost exactly where she had been earlier, as if the space itself belonged to her in a way the rest of the party did not. She must have moved at some point, refilled her glass, fulfilled the quiet obligations expected of her, but she had returned to that same position with the precision of someone who locates the one tolerable place in a room and holds to it. She listened to Alderman Whitmore with a composure that suggested attention, though her mind was clearly elsewhere, operating on a different plane entirely. Aara felt a flicker of hesitation. She admitted, almost carefully, that she had already seen her through the lens earlier and that she might have taken her photograph. Maya's reaction came with a small, knowing sound, half amusement and half caution. Her mother, she explained, valued documentation in a way that bordered on reverence. There was no escaping the fact that she would want to see it. They crossed the lawn together, the grass bending beneath their steps and springing back as if unwilling to hold evidence of their passing. The light had settled into that late June gold that softened everything it touched, turning the present moment into something that already felt like memory. Aara instinctively lifted her camera, framing the way sunlight filtered through the oak branches, then lowered it again. Not everything needed to be captured. Before they fully reached her, Saraphina turned. It wasn't the polite, socially trained movement of someone acknowledging approaching guests. It was more precise than that, more deliberate, as though she had sensed them before seeing them. Her attention moved first to Maya, warm and immediate, then shifted to Aara. For a brief instant, there it was again, that exacting unguarded focus. It didn't linger long enough to be defined, but in that fraction of a second it felt entirely real. She greeted Aara by name, her voice measured and deliberate, every word placed with intention. There was structure in it, an architecture of sound that left space rather than filling it. She expressed her pleasure at Aara's presence with a subtle irony, acknowledging the obvious truth that the gathering revolved around her. Aara deflected it lightly, attributing ownership of the entire event to her mother and positioning herself as little more than its subject. Something shifted in Saraphina's expression at that, so slight it could have been missed, like a distant change in light. Recognition, perhaps. Familiarity. The understanding of what it meant to be turned into an occasion. She redirected Whitmore with effortless grace, offering him an exit disguised as courtesy, and within seconds the conversation dissolved, leaving the three of them alone in a quiet pocket of the garden. Her attention returned fully to Aara. She mentioned Aara's graduation, the honors, the photography program, all delivered with the clarity of someone who had already taken note of the details. Then, without hesitation, she asked about her portfolio. The directness of it felt almost out of place in the softness of the setting, but there was no apology in it, only curiosity sharpened by purpose. Aara faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question's timing more than its content. Her work wasn't here, she explained, stumbling slightly over the instinct to offer it immediately. Saraphina clarified with the faintest trace of amusement that she had no intention of reviewing it in the middle of a garden party. The question had a different weight behind it. There was a project beginning soon. Something that might align with Aara's work, something worth discussing properly in a setting that allowed seriousness. The glance she cast over the party made it clear that this was not that setting. Aara agreed, the answer coming more easily than expected. Saraphina held her gaze for a moment longer, measuring without pressure, assessing without intrusion, and then released the moment as cleanly as she had initiated it. She offered a polite acknowledgement of the party's execution, directed at Aara, but clearly meant for her mother, and stepped away with the quiet authority of someone who never entirely relinquished control of a space, even when it technically belonged to someone else. Aara watched her go, the movement of her retreat as deliberate as everything else about her. Beside her, Maya spoke carefully, her tone balanced between observation and restraint. She recognized the pattern immediately. Professional interest in her mother's language was its own kind of approval. Where indifference looked like dismissal, engagement looked like opportunity. Aara barely responded. Her attention had shifted inward, searching for something she had seen earlier, but couldn't quite find again without the mediation of the lens. That particular quality Saraphina carried, standing within a crowd she had shaped, yet somehow separate from it, eluded her when viewed directly. She tried to name it and found the usual words insufficient. It wasn't simply loneliness, nor was it something clinical or detached. It felt more constructed than that, more intentional, like a life assembled with precision, every piece chosen carefully, every detail considered, and yet something within it remained just slightly misaligned. When she finally articulated it, it came out quietly, almost as a realization rather than a conclusion. It was the sense of someone living inside something they had built with care, something that held them securely but perhaps too tightly. Maya didn't answer immediately. When she did, it was with a quiet certainty that carried no surprise at all. They moved back into the flow of the party, conversation closing in around them once more. Aara kept her camera close to her chest, no longer raising it as often. Her thoughts had anchored themselves to a single moment, 4047, looping back to it with increasing clarity. That night, alone in her childhood room, she sat cross-legged on her bed, the familiar surroundings dimmed by time and distance. The posters had faded, the window still resisted opening in the humidity, and yet everything felt slightly smaller, as though she had outgrown not just the space but the version of herself that once fit inside it. Her camera rested in her hands. She had taken 11 photographs. 11 out of 36. Even for her, it was restraint pushed further than usual. Burwood offered images, but they were tangled in something too personal, too unresolved. The act of seeing clearly required distance, and she didn't yet have it. She didn't need to review the negatives to know which frame mattered most. The one taken at 47 stood apart. It wasn't just a strong image. It held something unguarded, something caught in the brief interval before awareness reshaped it. Saraphina, alone in a gathering she oversaw, her expression suspended between states, not quite sadness, not quite longing, but something quieter and more complex. It was the face of someone who had made peace with a life that still resisted full acceptance. A life chosen with intelligence and care, admirable in every measurable way, and yet subtly misfitted, like a structure that aligned perfectly on paper but felt different when inhabited. Aara set the camera aside, the weight of that realization lingering. Her phone lit up, a message from Maya, simple and direct. Thursday afternoon. A meeting, formally framed, deliberately arranged. Saraphina had cleared her schedule for it. Aara read it more than once before replying. She would be there. Thursday arrived already heavy with heat, the air thick before the day had fully begun. The sky stretched wide and pale, the kind of blue that left no room for ambiguity. She approached the Sterling house differently this time, choosing the formal entrance instead of the familiar back path of her childhood. The shift felt intentional, a quiet acknowledgement that this was no longer the same relationship, no longer the same version of herself. She rang the doorbell and waited. Saraphina answered it herself. There was something unexpectedly grounding in that. She was dressed for work, every element of her appearance reflecting the same deliberate precision Aara had already begun to associate with her. Clean lines, controlled structure, nothing excessive. Even the way she stood carried an economy of movement, as though nothing about her existed without purpose. She seemed interrupted, but not inconvenienced. Focused but not closed off. There was a steadiness to her, the kind that came from complete familiarity with one's own competence. She noted Aara's punctuality with approval and stepped aside to let her in. Inside, the house unfolded in contrast to its exterior. What appeared traditional and expected from the outside had been reshaped within. Walls had been opened, spaces reimagined, light allowed to move freely. The design resisted confinement to any single style, instead reflecting a life informed by movement, by experience, by a refusal to be limited to one definition. It was unmistakably hers. The house revealed itself in layers the longer Aara stood inside it. Architectural drawings hung on the walls beside art photographs, not in competition but in quiet conversation. A modernist lamp occupied the same space as an antique sideboard without tension, as if time itself had been folded rather than separated. Books filled every available surface, not arranged for display but handled, used, lived with, spines softened, pages marked, evidence of thought rather than decoration. What should have been a formal sitting room had been overtaken by a drafting table, its surface crowded with blueprints held down at the corners by smooth stones gathered from different places, each one carrying its own history into the present. It wasn't what she had expected, and she said so. Saraphina's response came without hesitation, a quiet acknowledgement that expectations rarely survived contact with reality. She gestured toward the kitchen with the same efficiency that defined everything else about her, already moving forward, already structuring the next 45 minutes with intention. Coffee came first. Time would be used properly. They settled at the kitchen island, though even that space resisted simplicity. Drawings and material samples spread across it in organized disarray, leaving just enough room for coffee cups to navigate between them, as if this balance had long since been perfected. Saraphina spoke the way she did everything else, without excess. No filler, no unnecessary softening, just clarity shaped into language. The project was the Whitfield house. Aara knew it immediately, not from study but from memory. Everyone in Burwood knew it. It existed at the far end of Main Street like something unresolved, a structure that had outlived its own certainty. Built in 1841, it had endured war, flood, fire, events that should have defined its history, but what marked it most was the slow unraveling that followed decades later. By the 1990s, the house had slipped into abandonment, left to weather time without care, its deterioration becoming part of the landscape itself. It had been photographed endlessly. People were drawn to it in the way they are drawn to beautiful ruins, symmetry broken just enough to feel poetic, vines reclaiming columns that once suggested permanence. It was easy to look at, easy to romanticize. But that wasn't the work. Saraphina's firm had been given the responsibility of restoring it fully, not just stabilizing its structure but returning it to its historical integrity, transforming it into a cultural space for the county. It was a long project, ambitious, demanding, and deeply visible. The kind of work that carried both expectation and scrutiny. What she needed was not a standard record. Anyone could document construction. That wasn't the point. She wanted something more precise, more difficult. Someone who could follow the life of the building through its transformation. Not just what changed physically, but what shifted conceptually. The decisions, the revisions, the movement between what the house had been and what it would become. She wanted the process itself to be seen as something human, not merely technical. She had already looked at Aara's work. That landed with a quiet weight. Aara's thesis had been built around spaces in transition, places caught between identities, structures being dismantled and remade. She had spent months documenting a changing neighborhood, trying to hold both loss and progress in the same frame without forcing the image to take a side. Others had called it balanced. To her it had simply been honest. Saraphina had seen that. There was no pretense in the way she said it. She reviewed the work of anyone she considered working with. It was not a favor, it was a standard. And what she had seen in Aara's images was exactly what this project required. The Whitfield house was not just a building in need of repair. It was something more complicated, a negotiation between memory and intention, between official narratives and lived experience. Aara turned her coffee cup slowly, feeling the weight of something she hadn't planned to say but couldn't ignore. She admitted her connection to the house. Not academic, not distant. Inherited. Her great-grandmother had worked there decades earlier, part of the unseen labor that sustained its daily life. The stories had filtered down through generations, shaping the way she understood the space long before she ever thought of photographing it. There would be no neutrality in how she saw it. The words settled between them without disruption. Saraphina didn't rush to respond. She considered it fully, as though the admission itself carried value beyond its surface. When she spoke, it reframed everything. That connection wasn't a limitation. It was precisely the qualification the project demanded. The idea of neutrality, she explained, was often nothing more than a disguise, a way of preserving dominant narratives without acknowledging them. What mattered was awareness, the ability to recognize the difference between what was officially recorded and what had actually been lived. Aara brought both. The clarity of it landed deeper than she expected. In years of studying photography, in countless conversations about perspective and responsibility, no one had articulated it so directly, so completely outside of her own discipline. Saraphina had named something that had existed at the edges of her thinking without ever fully taking shape. The decision came easily after that. She accepted the work. Saraphina responded with the same efficiency she had brought to everything else, sliding a folder across the counter. Contract, terms, timeline, all already defined. There was no lingering over the moment, no ceremony attached to agreement. Time was moving forward, and she had another commitment waiting. Aara stood, gathering the papers, holding back a question that pressed at the edges of her thoughts. There was something she wanted to understand, how Saraphina seemed to read spaces so precisely, how she knew what was required before it was spoken, but she recognized the boundary. This was not the moment for it. She thanked her instead. The response she received wasn't dismissive, but it wasn't indulgent either. Gratitude, Saraphina implied, would make more sense later. For now, there was only the work ahead and the complications that would come with it. The Heritage Board would have opinions, strong ones, the kind that expected to shape outcomes. Saraphina would stand behind her decisions, but Aara would need to stand behind them as well, clearly and without hesitation. There was no doubt in her answer. Saraphina acknowledged it as fact, not encouragement. At the door, the outside heat rushed in immediately, overtaking the carefully controlled interior. Aara stepped out into it, then paused despite herself, looking back once. Saraphina had already returned to the blueprints. Her focus had shifted completely, attention absorbed into the problem of the building as though the conversation had simply been one part of a larger structure, now continuing without interruption. She adjusted her glasses, leaned into the work, and disappeared into it. She didn't look up again. Aara left and signed the contract before the day had a chance to change her mind. The first weeks at the Whitfield house settled into a rhythm that felt almost instinctive. She arrived early, before the construction crews, while the building still held the quiet of its own existence. That hour alone became something essential. The absence of noise allowed the space to speak differently, not through sound but through presence. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't haunted. It was something denser than that, layered with time in a way that could be felt rather than explained. Every era of the house remained visible at once. The original structure, the additions, the modifications, the slow decay of recent decades, all of it coexisting without hierarchy, each layer pressing gently against the others. She photographed it before it changed. The damage, the patterns left by water spreading across plaster like unfamiliar maps, the worn floorboards in back rooms painted an unexpected blue, small, personal decisions preserved in fragments. Evidence of lives lived within the structure, choices made in private spaces where control had been limited but not entirely absent. She found a carved bird in the mantel of the east parlor, hidden where furniture would have concealed it. A mark made quietly, intentionally, without expectation of being seen. A declaration reduced to its simplest form. When she mentioned it, Saraphina came to see it herself. She stood there for a long time, studying it with the same attention she gave everything that mattered. It hadn't appeared in any official documentation, which didn't surprise her. The things that carried weight rarely did. When she spoke again, it was with quiet certainty. That detail would remain. It would be documented, protected, and preserved. It would not be erased in the name of restoration. I want it in the record. The statement carried no ambiguity, no room for negotiation. Aara told her she already had 3 images of it. Saraphina asked to see them, and Aara moved without hesitation, pulling out her phone to show the reference shots she had taken alongside her film work. The negatives weren't developed yet, but the digital images were enough for now. Saraphina studied each one with the same exacting attention she gave everything: drawings, materials, structural plans. Nothing was glanced at, everything was considered. When she finished, she handed the phone back without commentary. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It held a quiet alignment, the sense of 2 people arriving at the same conclusion without needing to articulate it. That became the pattern between them. In those early weeks, their work ran on parallel tracks that intersected at precise, meaningful points. Saraphina would be deep in a decision about the building, whether to return a window to its original configuration or preserve the alterations made decades later, and Aara would find herself circling the same question from the opposite direction. What was more honest to keep? What did it mean to represent something truthfully? Where did documentation end and interpretation begin? They were asking identical questions in different languages. The Heritage Board operated on an entirely different frequency. Their meetings took place in the basement of City Hall under fluorescent lighting that flattened everything it touched. The structure of the meetings suggested democracy, but the dynamics revealed something else: an unspoken certainty about authority, a quiet hierarchy masked as procedure. 11 members, most older, most deeply rooted in a version of Burwood that had always affirmed their place within it. Saraphina navigated them with surgical precision. She understood exactly how each person responded, who required historical justification, who needed economic reasoning, who simply wanted the illusion of influence before offering approval. She never distorted facts, never misrepresented the work, but she arranged truth strategically, presenting it in the form most likely to be accepted. It was a kind of discipline that didn't announce itself, but it was unmistakable. The issue with Aara's photography surfaced exactly when Saraphina had predicted it would. By the 3rd week, resistance found its voice. Clarence Holt brought the concern forward during a meeting, spreading Aara's prints across the table with deliberate care, as though presenting evidence in a case already decided. What he saw in them did not match what he believed had been approved. He expected documentation in the traditional sense, clean, neutral architectural images that recorded without interpretation. Instead, he saw shadows, deterioration, fragments of detail that resisted neat categorization. A carved mark not listed in any official record. To him, it looked like deviation, something subjective, something unnecessary. Aara responded before she could second-guess it. All photography carried interpretation. There was no such thing as a purely neutral image. The room shifted slightly at that. Holt wasn't accustomed to being addressed without invitation, especially not in contradiction. Saraphina didn't interrupt, she didn't correct, she watched, her attention sharpened, as though something worth noting had just occurred. Then she stepped in, redirecting the conversation with controlled ease. The project brief, she reminded them, had explicitly called for something beyond technical documentation. It had been agreed, recorded in their own minutes, that the restoration would be documented as a human story as well as a structural one. What Aara was producing aligned precisely with that intention. More than that, these images captured the building as it existed before intervention, before alteration erased what remained. That, she argued, was the most valuable record they could create. Years from now, when the house stood restored and refined, these images would be the only evidence of what had been there before. The carved detail Holt dismissed as irrelevant became, in her framing, something else entirely. Physical proof of a lived presence not documented elsewhere, a trace of a period preserved not in records but in memory, And when she connected that presence to local families, quietly, precisely, including Aara's own, the atmosphere in the room recalibrated. Historical accuracy alone hadn't persuaded them. Personal history did. Holt adjusted his position, reframing retreat as oversight. He would review the images moving forward. Saraphina accepted this with polite agreement that carried no real concession. The work would continue as intended. Afterward, in the dim light of the parking lot, the structure of the meeting fell away. Aara caught up to her, aware that something had shifted but unsure how to name it. She pointed out that the defense hadn't been necessary. Saraphina turned toward her, and for the first time, there was a visible trace of fatigue, not weakness, but the residue of sustained focus now released in private. She explained it simply. She had disagreed, so she had said so. Aara pushed slightly further, naming the detail that lingered. Her family history had been used to strengthen the argument. Saraphina didn't deflect. She clarified her reasoning without softening it. It had been relevant. It had mattered. Then she paused and asked if it had crossed a line. Aara considered the question honestly. It hadn't. It had felt accurate, necessary even. What unsettled her wasn't the use of the information. It was the fact that someone had defended her work with that level of clarity and certainty without consulting her first. The response came immediately. She should have asked. She hadn't. That was on her, and it would be different next time. No justification, no deflection, just correction. Aara stood there for a moment longer than she intended, studying her the way she would study a subject through a lens, looking for structure, for pattern, for something beneath the surface. Gratitude came out in pieces, directed at the work, at the building, at the quiet intervention that had just taken place. Saraphina accepted it without embellishment. The building deserved the work. That was reason enough. Then, almost as an afterthought but not quite, she added one more thing. The photographs were good, especially the way Aara handled shadows. It was said plainly, without performance, and then it was over. She got into her car and left, the moment complete without needing extension. Aara remained in the parking lot longer than necessary, the air still thick with heat, her thoughts circling that single word. Shadows. She carried it with her all the way home, through streets softened by darkness, through the quiet that followed the day. By the fourth week, Maya began to notice. Not anything explicit, nothing that could be pointed to directly, but a shift in tone, in attention, in the small, unspoken spaces between things. She had known Aara long enough to read those spaces accurately, to recognize change before it took shape in language. One evening, sitting on the porch with wine and the steady sound of cicadas filling the air, she named it lightly. There was something there, something in the way Aara spoke about the work, about her mother. Aara responded carefully, keeping her words aligned with what could be stated without complication. The work was engaging. Saraphina was intelligent. Both statements were true, and neither of them contained the whole truth. Maya understood that immediately. She described her mother not as lonely, but as someone fundamentally comfortable in solitude, a distinction that mattered. It wasn't absence that defined her, but containment. A life structured in a way that left little room for intrusion. Still, there was a shift. She spoke about the project often now, about Aara's work in particular. That in itself carried weight. Aara deflected at first, then asked directly for clarity. Maya didn't press. She let the observation remain what it was, something open, something not yet fixed into meaning. But she offered context, something deeper than speculation. The past few years had closed in on her mother in ways that had gone largely unspoken. Work had filled the space, so had family. It had been enough, functionally, structurally, but perhaps not entirely. What lingered was something quieter. The possibility that she had forgotten what it felt like to be fully seen. The word settled between them, unforced but undeniable. Aara recognized it immediately, not as theory but as experience. She had spent years surrounded by people who looked without truly seeing, who engaged without presence. She had learned the difference. What Saraphina brought to the work, to the conversations, to the way she engaged with the smallest details, was real. It wasn't performance. It was attention, fully given. And it moved both ways. Maya accepted that with a quiet nod, satisfied without needing to push further. The moment passed, gently redirected toward lighter things, toward fireflies flickering at the edge of the garden, toward anything that didn't require definition. August arrived with weight, the kind that settled into everything and refused to lift. The project shifted with it, moving into its next phase. Plans approved, resistance noted but contained, the work of rebuilding beginning in earnest. For Aara, the focus changed. The building was no longer just something to observe. It was something in motion now, something being negotiated daily between what had been and what would replace it. This was where her work sharpened, where instinct aligned with purpose. This was where she understood exactly what she was doing. She had always belonged to the middle of things. Not the beginning where everything still carried the illusion of certainty, and not the end, where meaning settled into something fixed and explainable. What held her was the in-between, the unsettled, transitional state where nothing was fully defined, where structures were still being decided, where intention and outcome had not yet agreed with each other. It was the only place that felt honest to her, the only place where truth hadn't been simplified into something easier to hold, The building lived there too. By mid-August, Saraphina had begun arriving earlier, not through declaration but through quiet repetition. One morning she was simply there sooner than expected, and then it happened again until it stopped being notable. By the third week they were both there by 7. By the fourth something else had formed between them, an understanding that the first hour belonged to silence. They worked alongside each other without needing to acknowledge it. The building spoke in small sounds, the slow shift of wood, the distant echo of morning outside, and their presence folded into that rhythm without disrupting it. When they did speak, it was only to exchange what was necessary. The carpenter believed the original window frames could be saved. That mattered. Aara already had the documentation Saraphina would ask for. Of course she did. The response came with the faintest trace of recognition, an ease that didn't require elaboration. Their communication had begun to compress itself, shedding excess, forming its own internal logic. Words became shorthand and shorthand became understanding. It wasn't something they had decided to build. It had accumulated, piece by piece, until it existed. Aara became aware of it slowly, the way you notice a pattern only after it has already settled into place. Around the same time she noticed something else, something quieter, more difficult to name. Each morning as she pulled into the lot, she found herself looking for Saraphina's car. Not out of necessity, not for any defined reason, just looking. The dark green of it had become familiar, the interior always ordered, the small architectural model resting on the dashboard like a private reference point. It had taken on the function of a landmark, something that oriented her before she even stepped out. A fixed point in a space that was otherwise constantly shifting. She recognized it for what it was, information. She held it carefully, the way she handled unexposed film, kept in the dark, protected from premature exposure, not yet ready to be developed into something fully understood. September brought rain that didn't pass. It settled in, steady and unrelenting, transforming everything it touched. The construction crew left early, the exterior work too dangerous to continue. Inside, the building remained, filled with the evidence of work but empty of people. By late afternoon, the silence had deepened into something almost complete. Aara stayed. She had been working in the library, the room uncovered behind a false wall in the east wing, a discovery so unexpected that even Saraphina had allowed herself a brief, unguarded moment of visible delight. The room had survived better than the rest, protected by its concealment. The shelves still stood, empty but intact. A desk remained in the corner, its surface worn but functional, its details preserved in quiet defiance of time. And there were papers, letters, records, fragments of correspondence that had endured where other things had not. The archivist had already begun cataloging them with a kind of reverence that bordered on awe. Aara approached them differently. She worked close, using the macro lens to study the smallest details, the texture of the paper, the way ink settled into its fibers, the subtle variations in pressure that revealed the movement of a hand across a page. It demanded stillness, attention, a kind of listening that only existed when nothing else competed for it. She heard the door before she saw her. The sound carried through the house, followed by footsteps she already recognized without needing to confirm. Saraphina paused briefly at the threshold of the library before stepping in. She had noticed the car. The explanation was simple. The crew had left. The light inside suggested someone hadn't. Aara stopped working mid-thought, aware that what she had been building internally would take time to return to. Saraphina asked to see what she had, and Aara obliged, scrolling through the reference images on her phone as they stood side by side at the desk. Saraphina examined them closely, leaning in, giving each frame the time it required. She noticed the variations in ink density immediately, the shifts in pressure mid-sentence that revealed interruption or hesitation. Aara followed the observation, expanding it. The pauses in writing, the moments where thought had broken and resumed, leaving visible traces behind. It wasn't just the letter that remained, it was the act of writing itself, preserved in fragments. Saraphina acknowledged it quietly, returning the phone. She had removed her coat at some point. Rain had marked her shirt, small dark patches across the fabric that she hadn't bothered to fix. Something about her presence had shifted, subtly but undeniably. The precision remained, but it had softened slightly, as though the effort required to maintain it had been set aside for the moment. She looked more like herself here. Aara mentioned the length of the day, the weight of the week. Saraphina moved toward the window, her attention drawn outward to the rain, and spoke about the board. They wanted changes, cheaper materials, adjustments justified as comparable though they weren't. The difference mattered not immediately but over time. In 20 years, the inconsistency would reveal itself. The building would show the compromise. Saraphina refused to allow that. Her reasoning was precise, rooted in the future rather than the present. The board's focus was short-term, constrained by budgets and immediate optics. Hers extended beyond that, toward the integrity of the structure as it would exist long after the current conversation was forgotten. They stood in silence again, both looking through the uneven glass of the window, the outside world distorted into something unfamiliar and strangely beautiful. Aara spoke her name. It was the first time she had done it directly, and it carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. The familiarity of the name didn't translate into ease. Saying it to her in this space, in this moment, changed its shape. Saraphina turned. Aara shifted to something else, something that had been waiting. The photograph from the party. She had developed the role. The image existed now, fully formed. Saraphina admitted she had been wondering about it. That acknowledgement altered the space between them. Aara felt the edge of a question she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. The photograph had been taken without permission, in a moment that hadn't been offered. It existed outside the boundaries of the work they were doing together. She asked anyway, whether it was acceptable to keep it, whether it should remain separate, unshared, or removed entirely. Saraphina didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked what it looked like. The question bypassed everything else, cutting directly to the thing that mattered. Aara answered without filtering it. It looked true. It looked like her. Something in Saraphina's expression shifted then, small adjustments moving across her face in sequence, not entirely concealed, not entirely revealed. She settled somewhere in between, careful, composed, but not closed. Keep it, she said, her voice steady but softer than before. And when you're ready, I'd like to see it. Aara exhaled slightly. She wasn't ready yet, not to show it, not to explain it. Saraphina accepted that without resistance, as if readiness were something that couldn't be hurried and shouldn't be. Outside, the rain swelled for a moment, striking the old glass in a sudden rush before easing back into its slow, deliberate rhythm. Aara spoke again, more carefully this time. She asked what had been on Saraphina's mind that day, at the party when their eyes had met through the lens. The question settled between them, heavy with everything it carried. It didn't belong to their work. It didn't belong to anything structured or professional. It belonged to that moment alone, the one that had stayed with her long after it passed. Saraphina didn't answer immediately. When she looked at Aara, something had shifted. The composure she wore so effortlessly in every other setting had thinned, revealing something quieter, less guarded. It wasn't the authority she brought to meetings or the precision she held in her work. It was something more exposed, something that hadn't been shaped for anyone else to see. She chose her words with care. She said that Aara had been looking at the party in the exact way she herself had felt inside it, and recognizing that, seeing it reflected back, had unsettled her. She paused, then added that noticing something like that came with risk. The word lingered, carrying its own kind of clarity. It didn't explain everything, but it illuminated enough to understand that there was more beneath it, something neither of them was naming directly. Aara didn't respond. Saraphina didn't continue. The rain filled the silence, steady and unbroken, speaking in place of everything left unsaid.